The air inside the cell was so cold that each breath turned into a pale mist. The metal walls were hard and smooth, and every surface seemed to carry the bite of ice. Lyra sat in the corner, her knees pulled close, her long arms wrapped around the small bundle in her lap. The baby stirred slightly, letting out a tiny sound, and she held him closer, shielding him from the chill as best she could. Her own body shivered, but she tried to keep her movements gentle so that the little one could rest. The cell was not large. A single dim light above flickered from time to time, sending shadows crawling across the floor. The sound of the station was distant, a low hum of machinery, broken now and then by faint creaks as if the metal around them was shifting. Lyra had been inside this place for many days. Though she had lost count of time, the same dull light made it hard to know when one day ended and the next began. She could feel the baby's tiny heart beating against her chest. His breathing was soft and uneven, a reminder of how fragile he was. She whispered words in her own language, the kind that were meant to calm him. Even if he could not understand, it helped her as much as it helped him. Each word was like a thin thread keeping her mind from falling into despair. Beyond the bars, the hallway was dark. She had not seen another living face since the day they were left here. That day was still sharp in her memory, the heavy footsteps, the sound of the lock closing, and the way the voices faded as the strangers walked away. She had hoped someone would come back, but the silence grew longer. Her skin, pale and faintly blue in the dim light, was marked with thin lines of frost. She had tried to keep moving, standing when she could, pacing the small space to keep warm. But the cold always crept back into her bones. Now, she saved her strength for holding the baby and keeping him close to her warmth. If she let herself grow too weak, he would have no one. She thought often of her home. The hills covered in silver grass, the sky that glowed with soft colors at night, the sound of water running through the streams near her village. The baby had never seen those things. He had only known this cold place, and that was not the life she wanted for him. Yet here they were, waiting for something she could not name, somewhere far away in the station. A soft alarm began to sound. It was faint, almost like the tone of a distant chime, and Lyra lifted her head slightly. She listened, wondering if it meant someone had returned. The sound faded after a few moments, leaving her with the same emptiness. She sighed and adjusted the wrap around the baby, tucking the edges more tightly so that no air could reach his skin. The station seemed alive in its own way. Sometimes it groaned. Sometimes it whispered in the form of soft hisses from unseen vents. The air was dry and carried a metallic taste. Every now and then, she thought she heard something far away, a faint clang, the scrape of metal, or the echo of something moving. She would wait, holding her breath, but nothing came closer. The silence would return like a heavy blanket. Her thoughts wandered to her partner, who had not been with her when she was brought here. She imagined his voice, the way he would have spoken to their child, the way he would have kept them warm. She told herself he was out there somewhere, but deep inside, she feared she might never see him again. That fear made her hold the baby tighter. The baby's tiny fingers curled around one of her own. His skin was warm compared to the air around them, and she smiled faintly at the touch. It reminded her why she had to keep going, even if the days felt endless, even if the cold was sharp. She had to protect him. She had to believe there was still a way out. A faint vibration passed through the floor beneath her. It was different from the usual hum, shorter, sharper, as if something had bumped into the station. Lyra's eyes widened. She shifted to a kneeling position and peered through the bars. The hallway remained dark, but now she was sure she had heard something new. It might have been nothing, just another sound in this strange place. Yet her heart began to beat faster. She waited, straining her ears. For a moment there was nothing, and she almost sat back down. Then, faintly, she caught the sound again, a distant thud, followed by the hiss of air moving through a door. This was not the regular rhythm of the station. This was different. Her hands tightened around the baby, and she felt a mix of fear and hope rise inside her. Perhaps someone had come after all. Perhaps the silence was about to end. the light above her flickered again, and the cold air seemed to stir as if touched by a new current. Lyra's eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the bars. She listened for footsteps, for voices, for anything that would tell her she was not alone anymore. She did not know that far away, in a small human ship drifting close to the station, a man named Darren was watching a faint signal on his console. He was studying it carefully, leaning forward in his seat, his mind telling him that it was worth the risk to check. The signal was weak, almost lost among the static, but it carried a pattern that felt like a call for help. Most would have ignored it. He did not. The station had been abandoned for years. According to the charts, its power systems were failing, and it was too far from trade routes to matter to most travelers. But Darren was not the kind to pass by something without looking closer. His small shuttle could dock with it, and his tools could get him through most locked doors. It was a decision that others might see as foolish, yet it was the kind of choice that came naturally to him. Back in the cell, Lyra did not know his name or that he was coming. All she knew was that the air felt different and that her heart told her something was changing. She whispered softly to her baby again, telling him to be strong. The baby gave a small sound, and she pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes. The station shifted again, the sound of metal echoing through the walls. Somewhere, a door opened. Footsteps began to move through the corridor, slow, careful, and getting closer. The shuttle drifted steadily through space, the black void outside broken only by the glimmer of distant stars. Darren kept his hands on the controls, guiding the small vessel toward the Aurora. The hum of the engines was steady, a comforting contrast to the chaos of the station behind them. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, still holding the baby close. The warmth of the shuttle had seeped into her body, slowly pushing out the chill that had clung to her for days. She watched the baby carefully, brushing his hair back from his forehead and adjusting the blanket so it covered him properly. His soft breathing was a small comfort, a reminder that they had survived the first stage of their escape. Darren glanced at her occasionally, noting the careful, quiet way she tended to her child. There was something in the way she held him, a protective strength that he recognized. Even though he was human and she was alien, he admired her silently, though he did not speak of it. Now was not the time. Ahead, the Aurora floated like a beacon, its long hull catching the faint starlight. The ship's docking bay lights blinked on, a welcoming sign. Darren activated the shuttle's external communication array. Aurora, this is Darren. I have passengers, requesting immediate docking permission, he said, voice calm but firm. Copy, Darren. We've been tracking your shuttle. Prepare for docking clearance. We'll have the bay open and ready for you, came the reply, the voice carrying a mix of surprise and relief. Darren adjusted the throttle, lining the shuttle with the docking bay entrance. Lyra watched the hull of the larger ship approach, its lights reflecting softly on the shuttle's windows. She had never seen a ship this large before. Even from the outside, it seemed alive, humming with energy and purpose. The baby stirred again, giving a small whimper. Lyra rubbed his back gently, speaking in soft, quiet sounds from her language. The warmth in the shuttle now felt safe, though she did not relax completely. She kept glancing at the viewport, half expecting something from the station to appear. In pursuit. Almost there, Darren murmured, more to himself than to her. He guided the shuttle with steady hands, careful not to jolt the baby or Lyra. The docking bay grew larger in view, the light from the ship's interior spilling outward. The shuttle bumped gently against the docking clamps. Darren released the throttle and set the engines to idle. The clamps locked into place with a quiet hum. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Lyra shifted, her gaze moving over the shuttle's interior before looking at him. She did not speak, but her eyes reflected relief. The baby was now resting quietly against her chest, his small eyes opening briefly to blink at the soft glow of the shuttle. Darren reached for the hatch controls. The door slid open smoothly, and the shuttle was now connected to the Aurora. The larger ship's interior lights bathed the small cabin in warmth. Lyra stepped forward carefully, holding the baby close. Darren followed, making sure she moved safely into the corridor. The first thing she noticed was the air, warmth, circulation, and light combined to create a sense of life that had been absent on the station. Lyra inhaled slowly, letting it fill her lungs. The baby stirred again, sensing the comfort around them, and cooed softly. A member of Darren's crew, a young technician named Mira, came forward. She had a look of awe on her face as she saw Lyra and the baby. "You're safe now," she said, gently, motioning to a medical station. "We'll get you checked and warm you up." Lyra nodded hesitantly, holding the baby tightly. She allowed Mira to help guide them to a comfortable seat. The medical bay was small but inviting, with warm surfaces and soft lighting. A heating panel above cast a gentle glow, and the air was rich with warmth, the opposite of the frozen corridors she had left behind. Darren followed, still keeping one eye on the shuttle controls to ensure nothing went wrong. Once Lyra was seated and the baby cradled safely, he allowed himself a small moment of relief. They had made it through the station, through the danger, and now the immediate threat was behind them. A medical drone hovered near Lyra and the baby, scanning for temperature and vital signs. The baby's readings were perfect: steady heart rate, normal breathing, body temperature rising nicely under the blanket. Lyra watched as the machine worked, her hands instinctively smoothing the blanket over him. Darren pulled up a seat nearby. "You're safe," he said quietly. "We'll get you warm and fed, and then we can figure out the next step." Lyra's eyes softened slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing. She nodded, grateful for the simple words and the calm tone. Even if she did not fully understand the language, the meaning was clear. They were no longer alone, no longer trapped, and for the first time in days, she could breathe without the weight of fear pressing down. The station's image faded from the Aurora's long-range sensors. Darren watched the display, noting the last readings. It would collapse entirely soon, sending fragments into the void. But that was no longer their concern. He had brought them to safety, and that was enough for now. Lyra adjusted the baby, letting him rest against her chest. His small hand curled around her finger, and she felt a quiet strength return. She had survived the cold, the fear, and the long days of uncertainty. Now she had warmth, safety, and someone who had risked everything to save them. Darren stood nearby, scanning the area but allowing them their space. He could feel the tension in the air slowly leaving, replaced by the faint hum of life aboard the Aurora. He allowed himself a brief glance at Lyra. She was not speaking, but the soft expressions in her eyes said enough: thanks, trust, and a quiet hope for the future. The crew moved gently around them, providing blankets, warm drinks, and comfort. Lyra accepted each gesture cautiously, her gaze occasionally meeting Darren's. She had survived a frozen prison, a broken station, and a dangerous escape. But here, in the warmth of the ship, she allowed herself to feel hope. Darren glanced back toward the shuttle hatch. It was still securely locked in place, the path from danger fully closed behind them. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax, though he stayed alert. They were safe, but space was unpredictable, and he would make sure. Nothing threatened them again. The baby yawned, curling closer against Lyra. She smiled faintly, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. The warmth, the light, the quiet hum of life around them. It was a world away from the cold and fear of the station. Darren stepped closer and gestured toward the seating area. "Stay here, rest," he said softly. She did not need to understand the words completely. She understood the intent. She was safe, and they had survived. The Aurora continued its slow journey through the outer system, engines steady, shields up, and life within the ship moving around them. Outside, the stars sparkled quietly, and the void felt less empty now that warmth and protection surrounded them. For Lyra and her baby, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where hope, safety, and the kindness of strangers could replace the cold and fear they had endured. The hallway stretched ahead, long and dim, with only small patches of light from broken panels in the ceiling. Frost clung to the walls, and every step made a faint crunch beneath their feet. Darren moved first, holding his light steady as it cut through the darkness. Behind him, Lyra followed closely, clutching her baby and keeping her eyes on the human's back. She did not know who he truly was, or why he had come here, but his movements told her something important. He was not wandering aimlessly. He walked with purpose, scanning corners, checking doors as they passed, always moving forward. That gave her a small sense of safety, though the station's groans reminded her that they were far from safe. The baby stirred in her arms and made a soft sound. Lyra whispered a short phrase in her own tongue, gently rocking him to calm him. Darren glanced over his shoulder for a moment, then slowed his pace so she could keep up. "You all right?" he asked quietly, though he knew she could not understand his words. Still, speaking out loud made the cold feel less heavy. They passed a side corridor where the light from his beam revealed a row of storage crates, half buried in frost. Darren paused just long enough to check if any could be opened. Most were sealed shut, but one lid gave way with a small creak. Inside were a few thermal blankets, folded but stiff from the cold. He took two and handed one to Lyra. She accepted it without a word, quickly wrapping it around her and the baby. The extra layer dulled the sharp bite of the cold, though her breath still came out in small clouds. She met his eyes for a moment, and though there was no shared language, he saw gratitude in her expression. They kept moving. The station's layout was unfamiliar to Darren, but his scanner was guiding them toward the docking bay. The problem was the warning light flashing on his wrist. The air temperature was still dropping, and power levels were falling faster than before. A low rumble echoed through the corridor. Dust drifted down from the ceiling as the metal frame groaned under some unseen strain. Lyra tightened her grip on the baby and quickened her pace, matching Darren's steps. They reached a section where the floor dipped slightly, and the frost was thicker. Darren tested each step before putting his weight down. Here, the silence was deeper, as if the sound was being swallowed by the ice. Halfway through the corridor, Darren stopped suddenly. He raised his hand, signaling Lyra to pause. His ears had caught something, not the usual creak of metal, but a soft, irregular tapping. It came from somewhere ahead, faint but clear in the stillness. Lyra heard it too. Her body tensed, and her eyes scanned the darkness. Darren adjusted his light and moved forward slowly. The tapping grew louder, then stopped. When the beam reached the far end of the corridor, they saw the source, a loose ventilation panel swaying gently in the cold air currents. It was harmless, but the sound had been enough to put them on edge. Just the station breathing. Darren murmured, more to himself than to her. They pressed on. The scanner beeped softly, showing that they were getting closer to the docking bay. But as they turned the next corner, they faced another problem. The corridor ahead was blocked by fallen beams and chunks of ceiling. Frost covered the debris like a thin white skin, and some pieces were still shifting slightly as the structure settled. Darren studied the blockage. Climbing over would be risky with the baby in her arms, and going back would cost precious time. He set his pack down, pulled out a compact cutting tool, and began clearing a narrow path. The tool hissed as it sliced through one of the smaller beams, sending small shards of ice to the floor. Lyra watched him work, her arms tightening around the baby each time the metal screeched. She understood the urgency, even without his words. The station's deep groans and distant rattles felt louder with every passing moment. After several minutes, Darren had cleared enough space for them to crawl through. He went first, making sure the path was stable. On the other side, he turned and reached back to help Lyra. She passed the baby to him carefully, then slid through herself. Once they were both clear, Darren handed the child back. "Almost there," he said softly, pointing down the corridor. The air here felt even colder, and the faint sound of wind seemed to whisper through unseen vents. Their footsteps echoed against the walls as they moved, the sound of their breaths the only other noise. Finally, they reached a wider hall. Faint light spilled in from the far end, and Darren's scanner confirmed that the docking bay was just beyond. Relief flickered in his chest, but he kept his guard up. The station was unstable, and anything could happen before they reached the shuttle. As they walked, Lyra glanced at the human from time to time. His face was calm but focused, and his steps never faltered. She did not know his name or why he had chosen to help, but something about him felt steady, like the ground under her feet. For Darren, each glance from her was a reminder of the trust she was beginning to place in him. It made his steps a little quicker, his grip on the light a little firmer. He had found people in bad places before, but never someone carrying a child through such cold and emptiness. When they reached the final door, Darren's relief turned to caution. The control panel was dark, and the locking mechanism was frozen. He knelt beside it, scraping away the frost and opening the small access plate. The wiring inside was stiff, but he managed to connect a portable power cell. The panel lit up weakly, and the door began to move. It opened only partway before stopping with a groan. Darren set his shoulder against it and pushed, forcing it wide. Enough for them to pass. Beyond was the docking bay, and the faint shape of his shuttle waiting in the gloom. Lyra stepped through first, her eyes scanning the space. She saw no other movement, only the cold metal floor and the dark shape of the vessel. Darren followed, already reaching for the controls to open the shuttle's hatch. They were close now, closer than they had been since the moment he found her. But as they crossed the bay, the station shuddered again, harder than before. Somewhere far behind them, metal tore with a sound like a distant roar. Darren glanced back toward the corridor they had just left. "We need to move," he said sharply. And though Lyra could not understand the words, the urgency in his voice was enough. They hurried toward the shuttle, the sound of the failing station following them like a warning. The docking bay groaned under the strain of the station's failing systems. The sound was deep and uneven, like a warning from the metal itself. Darren felt the vibration under his boots, sharp and quick, as if the floor might shift at any moment. He tightened his grip on his toolkit and motioned for Lyra to stay close. The shuttle stood only a short distance away, its hull dimly lit by the weak glow of its own lights. It was the one warm and living thing in this frozen space, a promise of safety in the middle of steel and ice. But between them and the hatch was a wide stretch of open floor that felt exposed. Lyra held her baby close, her eyes darting from the shuttle to the shadows high above. The docking bay ceiling was lined with beams, some cracked and hanging low. Bits of frost drifted down from time to time, catching the light as they fell. She had never seen a ship like his before, but something about its design looked strong, as if it could truly carry them away from here. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a sharp metallic crack from somewhere deep in the bay. The sound echoed, bouncing between the walls until it faded. Darren glanced upward and saw one of the overhead panels sagging slightly. It would not fall yet, but the warning was clear. They had little time before parts of this place began to break apart. He reached the shuttle first and began activating the hatch. The controls lit up under his touch, but the mechanism moved slowly, the cold making it sluggish. He tapped the panel again, urging it to work faster. "Come on," he muttered, watching the hatch inch upward. Behind him, Lyra kept scanning the space, every muscle tense. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a small, muffled cry. She shifted her weight, rocking him gently, her gaze fixed on the human's back. She did not know what he was saying to the door, but the tone told her it was urgent. At last, the hatch rose high enough for them to step inside. Darren turned to her and gestured quickly. She stepped forward, but before she could reach the opening, a faint alarm began to sound, a slow, pulsing tone that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Darren froze for a moment. He recognized the sound, a warning from the station's automated systems. The core was unstable. When that happened, sections of the station might seal themselves off or lose power completely. He looked at the hatch, then at the wide bay. Round them, they had to move now. "Inside," he said firmly, his voice low but urgent. Lyra hesitated only for a heartbeat before stepping toward the hatch. Darren moved to help her in, keeping one hand near the door controls. But just as she reached the threshold, the bay shuddered hard enough to knock them both slightly off balance. From somewhere high above, a thin beam of metal broke loose and crashed to the floor with a heavy clang. The sound rang through the bay, followed by another deep creak from the walls. Frost fell in small clouds, catching the dim light as it drifted down. Darren's instincts told him to get them out as fast as possible, He took the baby from Lyra, for a moment, helping her climb inside the shuttle. Once she was in, he handed the child back to her. "Strap in," he said, pointing toward the passenger seat. He turned back toward the bay, scanning for anything that might block their departure. The path to open space was still clear, but the large bay doors were sealed. He knew he would have to open them manually from the shuttle's controls once they were airborne. The moment he stepped inside and sealed the hatch, the noise from the station became more distant, muffled by the shuttle's walls. But it was still there, the groans, the distant cracks, the hum of something on the edge of failure. He slid into the pilot's seat and began powering up the systems. The shuttle's engines gave a low, steady vibration as they came to life. Warm light filled the small cabin, pushing back the cold. Lyra sat quietly in her seat, the baby wrapped in both the blanket and Darren's scarf. Her eyes stayed on him, her expression a mix of uncertainty and hope. The engines were ready, but the bay doors ahead remained shut. Darren's fingers moved quickly over the controls, sending the command to open them. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the massive doors began to shift, their edges glowing faintly as the old motors struggled against the cold. Halfway open, they slowed again. Darren frowned. If the doors stopped now, the shuttle would not have the clearance to get through. He tapped the panel again, urging the motors to keep working. The bay trembled once more, this time with a sharper, more dangerous edge. A second panel fell from the ceiling and smashed against the floor, sending shards of ice and metal in every direction. One piece struck the shuttle side, making a sharp metallic clang. Lyra flinched, holding the baby close. Her eyes flicked to the human, watching for his reaction. "We'll be fine," Darren said quickly, his tone steady, even though his hands moved faster on the controls. Finally, the bay doors reached full open. Beyond them lay the black expanse of space, dotted with the pale light of distant stars. Darren gripped the flight controls and lifted the shuttle off the ground. The landing struts folded away, and the vessel hovered for a moment before gliding forward. The shuttle passed through the open doors, leaving the bay behind. As soon as they cleared the edge, Darren accelerated, putting as much distance as he could between them and the station. Through the viewport, Lyra watched the metal walls of her prison grow smaller. The station hung in space like a frozen giant, its outer panels cracked and worn. For the first time since she had been taken there, she was on the outside looking in. Darren kept an eye on the scanner. The station's energy readings were unstable, flickering between weak and critical. He had made it just in time, another few minutes, and the docking bay might have sealed or collapsed entirely. In the quiet of the shuttle, the only sounds were the hum of the engines and the faint rustle of fabric. As Lyra adjusted the blanket round the baby, Darren glanced at her in the co-pilot's seat. She met his eyes for a brief moment, then looked away, as if unsure what to say without a shared language. It didn't matter. He could read enough in her expression: relief, exhaustion, and something else: trust. They were safe for the moment, but he knew the journey back to the Aurora was not over. The shuttle still had to cross the outer edges of the system, and the station's unstable core could still cause trouble if it failed in the wrong way. But for now, the hardest part was behind them, or so he hoped. The shuttle glided away from the station, engines humming with steady power. Darren kept one hand on the controls, eyes fixed on the scanner. Every few seconds, the display showed new warnings, unstable energy spikes from the station's core. It was only a matter of time before something inside gave way completely. In the seat beside him, Lyra held her baby close, keeping the blanket wrapped tight. The warmth of the shuttle was a small comfort after the cold of the station, but her body was still tense. She kept glancing at the viewport, where the dark shape of the station grew smaller with distance. The sight gave her relief, yet part of her feared that something might still reach out from it to pull them back. Darren noticed her gaze. "We'll be fine," he said quietly, even though he knew she could not understand. The tone mattered more than the words. He kept his voice calm, steady, like a hand guiding a frightened traveler. Then the scanner gave a sharp, urgent beep. Darren's eyes narrowed at the readings. The core's instability had reached its limit. In less than a minute, there would be an energy release. That meant debris. A lot of it. He tightened his grip on the controls. "Hold on," he said, glancing at Lyra. She looked at him with wide eyes, sensing his sudden focus. A moment later, the station lit up from within, a pale glow spilling out from cracks along its surface. Then came the silent flash, a burst of light with no sound in the vacuum of space. Panels, beams, and shards of frozen metal shot outward in all directions. The shockwave rippled through the thin atmosphere around the station. In the shuttles, Hull shuddered as it met the force. Darren reacted instantly, steering the shuttle into a sharper trajectory. Pieces of debris tumbled past, some no bigger than his hand, others large enough to crush the vessel if they struck at the wrong angle. The forward shields caught a few smaller fragments, sending faint ripples of light across the view. Lyra tightened her hold on the baby, bending slightly to shield him. Her eyes moved from the viewport to Darren's hands as they worked the controls. He was calm, but his movements were quick, precise, never stopping. She could feel the changes in the shuttle's motion, the way it swayed, then steadied, then swayed again as it dodged each threat. A beam of twisted metal spun past the front of the shuttle, close enough for its shadow to sweep across the cabin. Darren shifted them sharply to the left, the engine straining for a moment before leveling out. More debris appeared ahead, a cluster of broken panels drifting together in the shuttle's path. Darren adjusted their angle, sliding them through a narrow gap between two pieces. The shields shimmered faintly as they brushed past one panel, but it held. The station behind them was now breaking apart in slow motion, large sections separating and drifting into the darkness. Smaller fragments still moved faster, pushed by the initial force of the explosion. Darren knew they needed to get beyond the danger zone before one of those fragments found its mark. He opened the throttle, the shuttle responding with a low, steady roar. The stars ahead brightened as they moved faster, the station shrinking to a speck behind them. The scanner's warning tones began to slow, the debris becoming less dense. Lyra felt the change too. The motion of the shuttle grew smoother, the sudden sharp turns giving way to a steady forward push. She eased her grip on the blanket slightly, letting the baby's small face peek out. His eyes blinked in the dim light, adjusting to the warmth. For a few moments, there was only the hum of the engines and the soft breathing of the three souls inside. Darren glanced over at Lyra and saw her looking at the stars through the viewport. Her expression had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was lighter now, almost replaced by wonder. "You've never been out here like this, have you?" he asked softly, half smiling. Of course, she did not answer, but she held his gaze for a moment before looking back out at the expanse. Darren kept the shuttle on its course toward the Aurora. He could already see the faint blip on the long-range scanner showing the ship's location. With each passing minute, they were closer to safety. Still, he stayed alert. Space was vast, but not empty. Stray debris could still drift into their path, and the shuttle's shields were strong but not unbreakable. He checked the readings every few seconds, adjusting their angle when needed. Lyra sat back in her seat, her body beginning to relax. She looked at the human beside her, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead, the way his hands moved over the controls with quiet skill. She did not know why he had come for her, but she understood something important. He had not left her behind. The baby shifted in her arms, and she smiled faintly, pressing her cheek to his head. He was warm now, his breathing steady, for the first time in what felt like forever. She believed he might have a chance. The silence in the shuttle was gentle, not heavy like the silence in the cell. Here, it was the kind of quiet that led thoughts settle. Darren glanced at her again and gave a small nod, as if to say they were almost there. Minutes passed. The station was now far enough away that its broken pieces were just glints of light in the distance. The scanner showed no more incoming debris. Darren eased the throttle, letting the shuttle slow to a comfortable cruising speed. He tapped a small switch, and the comlink connected to the Aurora. A familiar voice came through, surprised and sharp. "Darren, where have you been? We lost your signal for a while. Had a detour." Darren replied, keeping his tone even. "Bringing passengers." Prepare the bay for docking. There was a pause on the other end, then the voice softened slightly. Copy that. We'll be ready. Lyra listened to the sound of his voice as he spoke to his crew. She could not understand the words, but she caught the shift in tone. Confident, certain, as if he had done this before. The stars ahead seemed brighter now, and somewhere out there, the Aurora was waiting. The thought brought a quiet sense of relief to both of them, though neither spoke it aloud, for now, the danger of the station was behind them. Ahead lay the unknown, but also the hope of safety. The shuttle drifted steadily through space, the black void outside broken only by the glimmer of distant stars. Darren kept his hands on the controls, guiding the small vessel toward the Aurora. The hum of the engines was steady, a comforting contrast to the chaos of the station behind them. Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, still holding the baby close. The warmth of the shuttle had seeped into her body, slowly pushing out the chill that had clung to her for days. She watched the baby carefully, brushing his hair back from his forehead and adjusting the blanket so it covered him properly. His soft breathing was a small comfort, a reminder that they had survived the first stage of their escape. Darren glanced at her occasionally, noting the careful, quiet way she tended to her child. There was something in the way she held him, a protective strength that he recognized. Even though he was human and she was alien, he admired her silently, though he did not speak of it. Now was not the time. Ahead, the Aurora floated like a beacon, its long hull catching the faint starlight. The ship's docking bay lights blinked on, a welcoming sign. Darren activated the shuttle's external communication array. Aurora, this is Darren. I have passengers, requesting immediate docking permission, he said, voice calm but firm. Copy, Darren. We've been tracking your shuttle. Prepare for docking clearance. We'll have the bay open and ready for you, came the reply, the voice carrying a mix of surprise and relief. Darren adjusted the throttle, lining the shuttle with the docking bay entrance. Lyra watched the hull of the larger ship approach, its lights reflecting softly on the shuttle's windows. She had never seen a ship this large before. Even from the outside, it seemed alive, humming with energy and purpose. The baby stirred again, giving a small whimper. Lyra rubbed his back gently, speaking in soft, quiet sounds from her language. The warmth in the shuttle now felt safe, though she did not relax completely. She kept glancing at the viewport, half expecting something from the station to appear. In pursuit, almost there, Darren murmured, more to himself than to her. He guided the shuttle with steady hands, careful not to jolt the baby or Lyra. The docking bay grew larger in view, the light from the ship's interior spilling outward. The shuttle bumped gently against the docking clamps. Darren released the throttle and set the engines to idle. The clamps locked into place with a quiet hum. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Lyra shifted, her gaze moving over the shuttle's interior before looking at him. She did not speak, but her eyes reflected relief. The baby was now resting quietly against her chest, his small eyes opening briefly to blink at the soft glow of the shuttle. Darren reached for the hatch controls. The door slid open smoothly, and the shuttle was now connected to the Aurora. The larger ship's interior lights bathed the small cabin in warmth. Lyra stepped forward carefully, holding the baby close. Darren followed, making sure she moved safely into the quarter. The first thing she noticed was the air, warmth, circulation, and light combined to create a sense of life that had been absent on the station. Lyra inhaled slowly, letting it fill her lungs. The baby stirred again, sensing the comfort around them, and cooed softly. A member of Darren's crew, a young technician named Mira, came forward. She had a look of awe on her face as she saw Lyra and the baby. You're safe now, she said, gently, motioning to a medical station. We'll get you checked and warm you up. Lyra nodded hesitantly, holding the baby tightly. She allowed Mira to help guide them to a comfortable seat. The medical bay was small but inviting, with warm surfaces and soft lighting. A heating panel above cast a gentle glow, and the air was rich with warmth, the opposite of the frozen corridors she had left behind. Darren followed, still keeping one eye on the shuttle controls to ensure nothing went wrong. Once Lyra was seated and the baby cradled safely, he allowed himself a small moment of relief. They had made it through the station, through the danger, and now the immediate threat was behind them. A medical drone hovered near Lyra and the baby, scanning for temperature and vital signs. The baby's readings were perfect: steady heart rate, normal breathing, body temperature rising nicely under the blanket. Lyra watched as the machine worked, her hands instinctively smoothing the blanket over him. Darren pulled up a seat nearby. "You're safe," he said quietly. "We'll get you warm and fed, and then we can figure out the next step." Lyra's eyes softened slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing. She nodded, grateful for the simple words and the calm tone. Even if she did not fully understand the language, the meaning was clear. They were no longer alone, no longer trapped, and for the first time in days, she could breathe without the weight of fear pressing down. The station's image faded from the Aurora's long-range sensors. Darren watched the display, noting the last readings. It would collapse entirely soon, sending fragments into the void. But that was no longer their concern. He had brought them to safety, and that was enough for now. Lyra adjusted the baby, letting him rest against her chest. His small hand curled around her finger, and she felt a quiet strength return. She had survived the cold, the fear, and the long days of uncertainty. Now she had warmth, safety, and someone who had risked everything to save them. Darren stood nearby, scanning the area but allowing them their space. He could feel the tension in the air slowly leaving, replaced by the faint hum of life aboard the Aurora. He allowed himself a brief glance at Lyra. She was not speaking, but the soft expressions in her eyes said enough: thanks, trust, and a quiet hope for the future. The crew moved gently around them, providing blankets, warm drinks, and comfort. Lyra accepted each gesture cautiously, her gaze occasionally meeting Darren's. She had survived a frozen prison, a broken station, and a dangerous escape. But here, in the warmth of the ship, she allowed herself to feel hope. Darren glanced back toward the shuttle hatch. It was still securely locked in place, the path from danger fully closed behind them. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax, though he stayed alert. They were safe, but space was unpredictable, and he would make sure. Nothing threatened them again. The baby yawned, curling closer against Lyra. She smiled faintly, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. The warmth, the light, the quiet hum of life around them. It was a world away from the cold and fear of the station. Darren stepped closer and gestured toward the seating area. "Stay here, rest," he said softly. She did not need to understand the words completely. She understood the intent. She was safe, and they had survived. The Aurora continued its slow journey through the outer system, engines steady, shields up, and life within the ship moving around them. Outside, the stars sparkled quietly, and the void felt less empty now that warmth and protection surrounded them. For Lyra and her baby, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where hope, safety, and the kindness of strangers could replace the cold and fear they had endured. The shuttle hatch had closed behind them, and the Aurora hummed steadily through space. Inside, the warmth of the ship surrounded Lyra and her baby, a comforting contrast to the freezing corridors of the station they had escaped. The tension that had clung to her shoulders for days was slowly melting away. Darren stood nearby, watching over them with careful attention. Even now, after guiding them through the danger, he remained alert. He knew space was unpredictable, but for the first time, he allowed himself a small measure of relief. They were safe. That was what mattered most. Lyra gently rocked the baby in her arms. His soft breathing was steady, and the warmth of the blankets and the shuttle's atmosphere had settled him. She pressed her cheek lightly against his head, listening to the quiet rhythm of life. It was a sound she had almost forgotten in the cold emptiness of the station. Mira, the young technician who had assisted them earlier, moved quietly around the room, checking on monitors and adjusting the cabin environment. "He's stable," she said softly to Lyra. "Warm, healthy, and resting comfortably." Lyra nodded, her eyes meeting Mira's briefly. Words were unnecessary. The relief in her expression was clear. After the days of fear and isolation, she finally allowed herself to feel hope. Darren approached and gestured toward a comfortable seat nearby. "Sit," he said gently. "You both need rest." Lyra followed his guidance, easing herself into the chair while cradling her child. The warmth of the cabin and the steady hum of the ship offered a small sense of normalcy she had not felt in weeks. Outside the viewport, stars stretched across the black void. Quiet and endless, the Aurora moved steadily toward its next destination, a beacon of life and order in the vast darkness. For the first time since she had been taken from her home, Lyra felt the possibility of a future that was safe, even bright. Darren pulled up a small tablet, scanning the shuttle and the surrounding area. The readings confirmed what he had hoped. The station was far behind them, and no immediate threats existed in the vicinity. He allowed himself a brief exhale. "Thank you," Lyra said quietly, her voice halting but sincere. It was not in words. He fully understood, but the tone and expression conveyed everything he needed to know. Darren offered a small nod, not needing to respond with words. Her gratitude was evident, and the bond of trust had begun to form between them. It was fragile, yet real. Mira approached with a warm blanket, offering it to Lyra and the baby. "You can rest," she said gently. "We'll take care of everything." For now, Lyra accepted it, feeling the soft fabric wrap around her and the baby. The warmth seeped into her bones, pushing back the memory of the station's frozen walls. For a long moment, the cabin was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the Aurora's engines and the gentle breathing of the child. Lyra allowed herself to relax, her shoulders dropping, her body easing into the seat. The baby stirred slightly, then nestled closer against her chest. Comforted by the warmth and motion, Darren moved to a nearby console. Checking the long-range sensors, the system was clear. The outer area of the system safe for travel. He began inputting coordinates for the ship's next waypoint, a station with supplies, warmth, and people who could offer the first steps toward rebuilding a life. Lyra watched him work, curiosity flickering in her eyes. She did not understand the technology, but she understood the purpose. He was ensuring their continued safety, guiding them forward in the vastness of space. It was a gesture of care, one that reassured her more than words ever could. Hours passed. Quietly, Lyra tended to the baby, feeding him and keeping him warm, while Darren monitored the ship's systems. Mira moved between them, offering assistance when needed, but largely allowing them the space to settle. The atmosphere aboard the Aurora was calm, steady, and alive, a world away from the cold and silence of the station. Finally, the baby drifted into a peaceful sleep. Lyra held him close, feeling the small rise and fall of his chest, and allowed herself a rare smile. Relief, gratitude, and a quiet hope mingled in her chest. For the first time since her capture, she believed in a future that was not defined by fear. Darren glanced at her, noting the subtle change in her demeanor. She was still cautious, still alert in small ways, but she was no longer frozen by fear. The trust was growing, and he knew that given time, it would deepen further. "Where are we going next?" she asked softly, her words halting but clear. "To a safe station," Darren replied. "Supplies, warmth, and others who can help. You will not be alone there." His voice was calm and certain, a reassurance that needed no translation. She nodded slowly, accepting the promise. The baby stirred again, and she adjusted his position, murmuring a few quiet words from her language. Darren watched silently, understanding the significance of these small actions, the comfort, the care, the restoration of normal life. The shuttle hummed steadily as it continued toward its destination. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly, indifferent yet beautiful. Inside, warmth, life, and trust began to fill the space that had been so empty for so long. Lyra allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time. The danger of the station, the cold, the fear, all of it was behind her. Ahead lay life, safety, and the hope of new beginnings. The baby slept peacefully, her hands steady and warm round him. Darren remained at the console, alert but calm, He had guided them from a frozen cell and a broken station to the warmth of the Aurora. The next steps would be careful, deliberate, but for now, they were safe. Minutes stretched into quiet hours. The hum of the engines, the gentle movements of the crew, and the small rhythm of life aboard the ship created a sense of stability. Lyra began to allow herself small moments of peace, each one reinforcing the reality that they had survived, that they were not alone, and that they could begin again. The baby shifted in her arms, and she smiled softly, pressing her cheek against his. Darren watched from a short distance, noting the gentle bond forming between mother and child. It was simple, yet profound, a sign that life persisted, that hope endured, and that the smallest gestures could carry meaning beyond words. The Aurora moved steadily through space, carrying its passengers towards safety and a new beginning. Lyra, her baby, and Darren, 3 lives connected by courage, trust, and the unspoken promise that they would face the future together died in the quiet of the shuttle. Surrounded by warmth, light, and the steady hum of engines, the frozen past began to melt away. Ahead lay possibilities, life, and hope. For the first time in a long time, Lyra allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them, and that a new chapter had begun, one written in safety, trust, and the small but profound courage of survival. The stars outside twinkled silently as the Aurora carried them onward. Within the ship, life and hope thrived once more, and for Lyra, the baby, and Darren, the journey through darkness had finally reached the light.